President Biden spent the day circling the wagons with one clear message. We are all in, and it is full steam ahead. How is that message being received tonight?
Well, it's interesting, Steph. I've been, texting and talking with some Biden advisors tonight. And for the first time in what has been a very rough 10 days since that debate, they feel like today wasn't a loss, that they may have finally made some progress in recovering the narrative a little bit. This was part of a 72-hour blitz that, frankly, a lot of Democrats wish they had seen a week earlier. The president did have that strong rally the day after the debate in which he vowed he was staying in, talked about when you get knocked down, you get back up. But then he sort of retreated from public view for a period of days before we started seeing the kind of pushback that we had today. What the president is doing, and it's so interesting, Steph, to see that this person who's been a fixture of Democratic politics for decades, really challenging his party. I dare you to take this nomination away from me. This is the kind of force, whether it's in an interview with Morning Joe to start the day, in that letter he sent to congressional leaders and members of Congress, rank and file, to talk about the fact that this a weakening of our resolve would actually only help Trump, or the conversation he had with some top donors today as well. This is the kind of repeated affirmation of his willingness, of his resolve to keep fighting in the race that Democrats want to see moving forward. The challenge for this president, though, is he has to now almost repeat it on a daily basis. The scrutiny on him, especially from lawmakers, is so high, and he really can't afford any missteps at this point.
Susan, those who said today, well, the president came out swinging today, why didn't he do it last week? Doesn't it show that the president is thoughtful, he's a listener, he's reflective, that he actually took the onslaught of criticism and negative feedback after that debate, listened, circled up with his team, with his advisors, and said, no, I've looked at the field, I know what I can do, and I'm doubling down. Shouldn't one take it as a positive that he spent the week listening, working, and coming to this conclusion?
Steph, I listened carefully to that interview that the president gave this morning on Morning Joe, and I have to say it didn't sound very reflective to me. It sounded like he was blaming people who were criticizing him, pretending that this was some sort of external event that had occurred, as opposed to his own performance being at issue. I think that there's a level of sort of deflection here and blaming the media narrative, blaming Democrats in his own party for being bedwetters. It's not reflective of polls that suggest that 3/4 of Americans, that includes an awful lot of Democrats, it includes an awful lot of independents, people who supported Joe Biden in 2020, who made him the president, who are concerned about him running for another term in office, given that he is already the oldest president we've had, that he's asking to be returned to office when he's 86 years old. Those poll numbers were terrible for Biden even before the debate, and they have certainly not gotten better for him. So the idea that there's, some sort of illegitimate questions being raised about him. The problem, of course, is that it's too late in the election cycle. And I think the president and his political team are very skillfully making the argument that it's too late, that the Democratic primary process has gone underway. If you were going to have a debate like this, it should have happened last year. But arguably, it's not the elites that Biden is blaming today that's the reason for that. They're the ones who stood by Joe Biden a year ago when we could have had this conversation.
Mike, the president also spoke with the Congressional Black Caucus tonight, whose support he needs. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the president spoke for about 20 minutes and really found a group of some of his most ardent supporters. We just got a readout from our Capitol Hill team about that conversation. And it's notable that this is the group that the president is speaking to, because when he talks about his resolve to stay in this race, when he talks about this as a choice almost between the elites versus the rank and file, the voters in this country, he's also talking about the backbone of the party. And that is where he has found some of the strongest support of late. He spent some time in Philadelphia over the weekend, which began at a black church. We know how important this group of voters was to putting the president back on a path to winning the nomination when he was at the depths of his campaign after Iowa, after New Hampshire. And so this is a part of the president also signaling to the rest of the party that he has the kind of support among the Democratic base that he needs going forward, and that he can continue to build on this from here.
Can he continue to go after the elites while at the same time, Michael, he's doing a call with almost 400 of his biggest donors today?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because the president in that interview with Morning Joe said he doesn't care about what the millionaires think. And then he spent a big chunk of time this afternoon listening to some of those top donors. This is sort of the reality of the position that he's in. The Biden campaign has said that he actually has had the best grassroots fundraising so far to start the month of July than he's had of any month going forward. But they also recognize that some of the most agitated, the term they like to use, the bedwettingest of the Democratic constituencies are these donors. And so it was important to have that reassurance. I thought what was so interesting was one of the things the president said, because there was a lot of talk about his debate and what he would do to prepare differently or be more aggressive next time. One point, the president said his strategy for the next debate: attack, 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 attack. He knows that he needed to be tougher on Donald Trump and let him off the hook perhaps the first time. We'll see if he gets that second time in September as scheduled.
Dave, there are some big, loud voices standing up and speaking up for the president, John Fetterman being one of them. I want to share a bit of what he said to my colleague Jen Psaki tonight.
Polls are going to be up, polls are going to be down. Some people are going to have bad days or good days. But Joe Biden's never going to bribe a porn star and get convicted and is a felon for that. And it's really strange when you have Project 2025, and that's Trump's, that's his plan. And why people are more worried about what time Joe Biden might go to bed or these other things, when it's really, we need to get serious and realize what's here.
Dave, how and when does this conversation within the Democratic Party come to an end?
Well, that's a good question, because I think you saw a slowdown in the number of Democrats going on the record today. There was a talk over the weekend of what would happen when House Democrats returned. Would the dam break? It didn't. There weren't many defections today. And I think the president has been lucky in his opponents. We were talking about those elites. If there was one consistent message from Biden's critics within the Democratic Party after the debate, if it was, we need a better messenger, the vice president's a better messenger, we should swap in the vice president, that might have gone further. What you saw instead was a sort of loopy, grab anything, throw anything argument from a lot of people with money, a lot of people with columns saying, maybe we need a blitz convention, maybe we need a shortened convention, maybe we need a mini primary before the convention, maybe an open convention. And that is more chaos than Joe Biden is offering to the party. They didn't offer a simple choice, even though the ask is pretty simple. You heard it from John Fetterman. He mentioned Project 2025. Democrats are very clear what they wanted Biden to do in the debate. Look in command and mention a few of his accomplishments to stick with people so that the conversation can change from his age to his record versus the Trump record. They need a candidate who can do that. And if you listen to whatever Democrat is saying, they just need to be convinced that he can do that, because a week of people speculating about some magical solution that's never been tried to replace him has not been convincing to the rank and file.
Maybe it's time to focus back on the achievements and the policies, because, again, Donald Trump may have had a better performance, but in that performance, he pushed lie after lie, and he needs to be called out on it. Susan, I do want to talk about France, because the country had crucial elections this weekend where the far right suffered a big loss. What do we need to know?
Well, I mean, what's interesting about the French election, right, is that it was a big gamble by President Macron in the wake of a very strong showing by the far right in the European Parliament elections. He decided to go ahead and call early elections for the French Parliament. This was very risky. His own centrist party, suffered a defeat. In the first round, it looked as if the very far right party of Marine Le Pen was actually poised to take a majority in Parliament and possibly be in a position to appoint the new French prime minister. What happened in the second round of voting, and again, this is a different system than in the United States, so an exact parallel is not possible here, but essentially what you had is what you might call a loose alliance of the Democratic small d forces coming together across a wide swath of the political spectrum, from the left to the center to team up to make sure that the far right did not take control. This was an unlooked for result in the second round of voting after the very strong showing by the right in the first round of voting. And, you know, I'm sure there are a lot of people in the United States who look at this and say Donald Trump is that level or even more of a threat to American democracy than Marine Le Pen was in France, and people need to come together. All I would say about the debate that's taking place right now among Democrats is that it is a debate not pay attention to Donald Trump, but who is in the best position to take on Donald Trump in the fall. And I think Dave's point is an important one. An obvious, easy solution that would be a clear-cut advantage over Biden has not necessarily materialized for many in the party. And I think that's why we are where we are right now. But it's very much in the context of Democrats being united in wanting to take on Trump with the strongest possible candidate and people worrying about whether Joe Biden is that person.
Let's go back to France, though, Dave, because on that call with donors, the president compared what happened in France to the MAGA movement here. What do you think his campaign needs to do to build that kind of coalition, right? People with different views and different parties coming together, voting together against the far right.
He had that coalition in 2020. That's a little bit of the story of the last Biden campaign, where a lot of voters who were disgruntled in 2016 didn't like their choices. People on the left who didn't like Hillary Clinton for various reasons came back and supported Joe Biden. And the opposite has happened this cycle, where you have 2020 Biden voters. This has been his biggest problem. Non-white voters who've drifted away, left-wing voters who are angry about Gaza. I think the reality of the world political situation needs to change for him, which is obviously something the White House is working on. But you mentioned the election in France. A problem for Labour in the UK, even though they won a landslide, they lost some safe seats. They almost lost some other safe seats because of a Gaza protest vote. And that is a situation that the French parties did not have to deal with in the same way, a situation that did not exist in 2020. When he gets past, if he gets past the current problems and the criticism of his age, stitching together that popular front, as it was called in France, as Democrats want to have here, requires things around the world to change and people on the left and non-white voters in the Democratic Party to become more content with what he's been doing.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.